The Realme GT series is back with the GT7 and the GT7T, and I have been using both side by side for 2 weeks now. The GT7 is clearly the more premium of the two and priced accordingly. It brings some important upgrades over its cheaper sibling like a more powerful processor and a more versatile camera setup. But the GT7T is no slouch either. In fact, it holds its own surprisingly well, especially when you consider the price difference. Stick around because I'll tell you which one is the better pick, and if you like no-nonsense tech comparisons like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next one. Let's start with the colors and build because it's a bit confusing but also kind of cool. Both the GT7 and GT7T come in blue and black, and honestly, the blue is my favorite color. But the GT7T goes one step further with a racing yellow variant that comes with a leather back and a racing stripe down the side. It's bold, unapologetically sporty, and if you're into that kind of aesthetic, this is definitely the version to get. What's interesting is that the GT7T gets the more eye-catching finish, even though the GT7 is technically the more performance-focused phone. That's probably because Realme saved the real showstopper for this, the GT7 Dream Edition. It's got the exact same specs as the regular GT7, but it's co-designed with the Aston Martin Aramco F1 team, and it absolutely looks the part. You get the stunning Aston Martin green finish, an aerodynamic wing-inspired back, and a finely engraved silver wing emblem that adds a touch of pure luxury. Anyway, back to the regular GT7 phones. It's clear Realme is going for a consistent design language across the GT series, taking cues from last year's GT7 Pro. You've got the same squarish camera module and boxy look, but the regular GT7 uses a plastic mid-frame and a fiberglass back. Basically fancy plastic, but that still feels pretty nice in hand. The GT7T definitely feels more premium out of the box, but I'm not entirely sure how that leather finish will hold up over time. And while you do get a case in the box, it kind of feels like a crime to cover up this phone. The good news is that both the GT7 and the GT7T come with an IP69 rating for dust and water resistance. But the GT7 does have a slight edge in durability with Gorilla Glass 7 eye protection on the front compared to Dragon Trail Star D Plus on the 7T. Now these are big phones, definitely not one-handed devices. But the yellow variant of the GT7T, which is slightly thicker and heavier on paper, actually feels lighter and more ergonomic in hand. The flat sides on both phones add to that boxy feel, but the GT7's edges dug into my palms a bit more. Apart from that, the two are nearly identical in design and both are solidly built. Now let's talk screens. Both phones come with excellent 1.5K flat AMOLED displays running at 120Hz, and they look fantastic. The GT7T is slightly larger at 6.8 inches and technically offers a higher resolution, but unless you're actively pixel peeping, you won't really notice a difference. Where you will notice a difference is in the panel tech. The GT7 uses an LTPO panel while the GT7T sticks to LTPS. What that means is that the GT7 can dynamically adjust its refresh rate between 1Hz and 120Hz, saving battery during static use. The GT7 also has a few more spec wins. It supports both HDR10+ and Dolby Vision, while the GT7T sticks to HDR10+. Not a deal breaker, but worth noting if you care about video quality. The GT7 also gets a staggering 6000 nit peak brightness, but that level of brightness is reserved for very specific parts of the screen for very short bursts. What really matters is high brightness mode. 1600 nits on the GT7 versus 1000 nits on the GT7T. In sunlight, both are very usable, but the GT7 does feel slightly brighter. Both also have fast in-display scanners and both work without a hitch. Day to day, they feel nearly identical, but if Dolby Vision and that extra brightness matter to you, the GT7 has a slight edge. There's also a surprisingly good tactile response. The haptics are sharp and satisfying on both phones. Same story with the stereo speakers, well-balanced, loud and similar across GT7 and 7T. Now, let's get into the fun stuff, which is performance. Now, this is the real reason why I wanted to compare these two phones despite the price gap. I remember when we tested the GT6 and the GT6T last year, the difference in performance wasn't that dramatic. In fact, the cheaper GT6T outperformed the GT6 in certain benchmarks, But that's not the case this time. The GT7 is powered by the MediaTek Dimensity 9400E, while the GT70 runs on the Dimensity 8400 Max. And in every benchmark we threw at them, the GT7 came out ahead. Whether it was Antutu or Geekbench, the results were clear. The GT7 packs more raw power. But the real difference shows up when you game. The GT7 offers 120 FPS gameplay at smooth graphics and ultra frame rates, while the GT70 tops out at 90 FPS. So Realme isn't leaving any ambiguity here. The GT7 is the one built for serious gaming. Now both phones do get warm during benchmarks, especially the GT7, which touched around 45 degrees. But during a 30-minute BGMI session, temps were far more reasonable. Around 38 degrees Celsius on the GT7 and 35 degrees Celsius on the GT70, both with GT mode enabled. I also saw no signs of stutters or lag on either device while gaming. That's likely thanks to Realme's new graphene-based thermal design, which seems to be doing a good job of pulling heat away from the CPU and keeping things stable. In real-world use, I had zero performance issues. But if you're picking based on stability, the GT7 pulls ahead as it did better in our CPU throttling test and had far fewer performance dips compared to the GT70. One thing I really appreciate is that both GT7 and GT70 come with 12 GB of RAM on the base variant itself. Moving on, the second major difference between these two phones is their camera systems. The GT7 has a 50 megapixel Sony IMX906 main camera with OIS, a 50 megapixel telephoto camera with 2x optical zoom, and an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera. The 7T on the other hand also has a 50 megapixel OIS main camera, but its sensor is the lower spec IMX896. Then it gets the same ultra-wide sensor as the GT7 and no telephoto camera at all. In well-lit scenarios, both phones go neck and neck. Their primary sensors deliver similar detail and dynamic range, but the 7T favors brighter photos and the GT7 leans towards higher contrast. Low light shots are also quite close, just that the GT7 extracts a bit more detail in the shadows. But video is where things get interesting. In bright outdoor light, the GT7 looks more stable. But indoors or in tricky lighting, the GT70 handles jitter better. The GT7 can shoot 8K at 30 FPS, but both phones offer 4K 60 FPS on front and rear cameras. The 8 megapixel ultra-wide cameras on both phones are evenly matched and give serviceable photographs. Nothing special here. However, it's the dedicated telephoto camera on the GT7 that I was most interested in. It is a 50 megapixel sensor, but it comes without OIS. Also, its focal length equivalent of 47mm makes it ideal for portraits but not for long-range zoom. The sensor takes pretty good portrait photos in daylight, but as there is no OIS, indoor and low-light portraits turn out to be mostly blurry. And this is a major bummer since most phones these days, including the GT7T, can do 2x lossless zoom from the primary sensors themselves. In fact, the indoor and low-light portrait shots from the 70 came out to be much better since it was using its superior main sensor. Both phones have the same 32 megapixel front camera, but the color science is noticeably different. The GT7 leans warmer while the GT70 whitens skin tones a bit. Honestly, I wasn't blown away by either. Ultimately, when it comes to cameras, the GT7 has a more versatile camera setup, but as far as photos are concerned, the 7T will keep you happy. Now both phones come with the same battery and charging setup, and honestly, I am not complaining. We're talking a massive 7000 mAh battery paired with 120 watt fast charging. That's the kind of spec sheet that makes you do a double take. It's overkill in the best way possible. In a quick 30-minute BGMI test, the GT7 just dropped 6% battery while the GT70 lost 7%. But after nearly 8 hours of mixed use, YouTube, gaming, photos and calls, the GT7 still had about 50% left while the GT70 was down to 41%. Not a huge gap, but definitely noticeable. Most of that likely comes down to the better optimized and more efficient Dimensity 9400E chip inside the GT7. Still, the GT70 isn't far behind. And if endurance matters to you, you're in very good hands with either one. Charging is also pretty great. 120 watt fast charging gets the GT7 from 0 to 100% in about 42 minutes, And the GT70 follows closely behind at around 44 minutes. As for software, both run Android 15 with Realme UI 6 right out of the box. And yes, I know Realme UI doesn't always have the best rep. People usually associate it with bloatware, spammy notifications, and a cluttered experience. But this isn't that. What you get here is essentially the same experience you'd find on Oppo's ColorOS or OnePlus's Oxygen OS. If you've used either of those, you already know what to expect: a snappy UI, smooth animations, and a ton of customization options. There are a couple of third-party apps pre-installed, but they can be removed in seconds. You also get 4 years of Android updates and 6 years of security patches on both devices, which I think is very reasonable. So, here's the bottom line. The Realme GT7 is the better phone overall. It's faster, more stable under load, and more efficient. The camera is nothing to brag about, but if gaming is your top priority, the GT7 is the one to get. But if you're looking to save a few bucks and still get great performance, the GT70 is still a solid pick. Personally, I'd wait for the GT7 to drop by 3,000 to 4,000 rupees during a sale and grab it then if you've got the patience.